All right, I have a Nina Simone quote for you. If you don't know who she is, she was a singer. Her most famous song is probably uh, what is the name of that song? Feeling Good. But she also wrote a song called For Women, which is great. And she does a cover of a song called Sinner Man. Nobody knows who really wrote that, but if you've never listened to her, go listen to her. And what is freedom to me? No fear. So we're talking kind of like a cultural mix today. And I want to introduce you to this idea of visible and invisible culture. So usually when people take a class like human geography, they come in with all kinds of expectations. Either they think we're going to talk about maps, which we don't really talk about maps. They think we're going to talk about migration. Sometimes people are like, oh, human geography is about migration. I mean, sure, but not that's a part of it, absolutely. And then some people think we're going to talk about kind of like surface cultural traits, like what people eat, what people wear. Those are all parts of what we call visible culture. So if this is an iceberg, and above the iceberg, the things that we see from culture, things like language, things like holiday customs, things like food, the way that you dress, visual arts, all of those are kind of the visible parts of our culture. But then underneath, and this is what we try to get at the heart of understanding humans and understanding human geography, are things like the nature of friendship and how that is highly cultural, and that varies very much around the world. Ideas of beauty, body language, how close you stand to somebody, how far away you stand from somebody. If we're in Sweden, when Sweden had to start social distancing, there was no need to start social distancing because they already stand like 10 feet away from each other. But if you go to Peru or if you go to other parts of the world, people are like right up here. And then we could go to Europe and people kiss on Southern Europe, not Scandinavian Europe. People kiss each other right on their cheek. Or if we go to the Maori culture in today's New Zealand, the way that Maori people greet each other is by putting their foreheads together and then rubbing noses. So all of these forms of greeting are also a form of intimacy, and it shows you the intimacy. It shows you different ways that people reveal themselves in cultures. Attitudes towards age, this is a good one because we live in a culture that is very much youth obsessed, but that's not true everywhere in the world. Ideas of modesty, ideas of what is modest. For example, in India, showing your midriff, this part right here, is something that is normal, whereas your shoulders, not so much. But here in the US, we don't always go out showing our midriff, but showing your shoulders is not considered nearly as big of a deal as like showing your belly button, right? Views on raising children and how you raise children and who's supposed to raise children and how many people are supposed to be involved in raising children, even ideas about family structure, ideas about cleanliness, importance of time, how time is structured. The and one of the reasons that we really want to get into and understand visible and invisible culture is that all of these invisible things are things that we don't really talk about. But when we live in a culture like the US, and the US is unique, except it's not super unique anymore. It's a country of immigrants, right? And if we think about many of our countries in the world, they're countries that were colonized and that are now have like a whole bunch of different immigrant groups or previous immigrant groups in them. And so what you get in a country that is really a multinational cultural country, which the majority of countries in the world today are multinational, meaning that there's a lot of different nations, cultures represented, what you get in that is a lot of cultures and then a dominant culture. And that dominant culture comes to define things that we don't really talk about in culture. Things like body language, things like values, things like correct religious beliefs, notions of beauty, etiquette, cleanliness, importance of time, assumptions about what kind of a person you are based on all of these other things. So we want to keep in mind that when we live in a culture that has one dominant culture and many other cultures kind of fragmented inside that dominant culture, that we take these invisible parts of culture as kind of like commonplace instead of seeing them as highly cultural. So our idea of human geography today comes from a person named Carl Sauer. So Carl Sauer was a human geographer. Sometimes he's called the father of human geography. Now, people had been studying culture and how culture relates to the natural landscape long before Carl Sauer, but Carl Sauer is the first person who kind of like put it into words and writing. And so today's geographers, today's study of human geography is based largely on what Carl Sauer set up as the basis of human geography. And that is that we have things that create our natural landscape, right? Geology. Geology is long periods of time. You know, we have a whole other timeline in geology when we study geology, whereas history, human history, you might go by centuries, whereas in geology, a century is nothing. So you're going by millions of years and billions of years. So geologic time is, we're talking millions and billions of years. Climate, when we talk about the climate, again, climate takes, so a lot of people confuse climate and weather. Climate is long-term changes in the atmosphere. So you have to have a pattern in the atmosphere for at least 30 years before it's considered climate, at least 30 years. So climate, again, is very, very long-term. And then vegetation, and vegetation adapts to geology and climate. But these things together, plus time, lead to things like weather, land, surface area, types of soil, types of drainage patterns, mineral resources, what your coast looks like. Here in California, we have an emergent coastline. It's an erosional coastline where essentially the continent is coming out of the ocean and the waves are eroding up against the coast of California, as opposed to the other side of North America, which is a result of deposition. So you have a depositional coastline there, where basically the Appalachian Mountains have been eroded away for millions of years, and that eroded material has formed, and this is very, very basic, but that eroded material has formed the entire eastern coastline of the states like the Carolinas, Georgia, all of that. So that depositional coastline looks very different than our erosional coastline over here. So long-term processes, geology and climate over time form our natural landscape. And then our natural landscape, you put humans on top of that, you factor in humans plus time plus the natural landscape, and then what we get is population, density, mobility, housing, urban structure, types of economies, types of religion, types of family structure, all the things that we include in the cultural landscape. So this is really the study of geography. Geology plus climate over time equals the natural landscape, and the natural landscape plus humans over time equals all of the kind of particularly human parts of us, where our population lives, how our population lives, what our housing styles are. So let me go through some of these examples. There's the world, yay. So let's talk about funerals. Funerals are something that we tend to hold very, very sacred in our cultures, but again, are highly cultural. So here we are in the US, and we live in a dominant culture that says when people die, we mourn. And everybody mourns everywhere around the world. Everybody feels sad when somebody dies. But there's different ways of expressing that mourning. Here, expressing the mourning is all about being somber. It's all about being quiet, being somber, saying things. If you're not crying when somebody dies, that might be a judgment on you, because the cultural norm is that somebody dies and you're sad, right? And so the way that we express, or the kind of different ways that we might express death and what to do when somebody dies here, tends to be a somber, like, deep mourning, as opposed to, we could go other parts of the world where, once again, you have people dying and you're sad that those people die, but you're more concerned with the celebration of their life. So a lot of cultures in the world, instead of having a somber mourning, have a celebration of life. If death is inevitable, we're going to be sad, but it could also be, what's the word? It could also be cathartic to celebrate and enjoy their life. That could be a different cathartic process of mourning. So I have here two different specific types of mourning. Sitting Shiva is what you do in Judaism. It's a 7-day long period. You cover up the mirrors. You're not supposed to look at yourself because of modesty. This is supposed to be about the person who died. You literally sit Shiva for 7 days. People come and visit you. They bring you food. Do not bring flowers. Don't bring flowers to a Jewish funeral. And that period of mourning, 7 days, and when that's over, you're done mourning. If it was your spouse, it's a 30-day mourning period. Now, for 30 days, you're not sitting like this without the mirrors, but you're mourning for 30 days. Now, if you think about that as being highly structured, it is highly structured. But think about how death is a normal part of our lives, right? That we inevitably are all going to die. And so if you live in like, for example, Judaism is 6,000 years old, and the people who first formed Judaism would have been shepherds in the middle of Southwest Asia. And when they formed Judaism, the common cultural practices, like, for example, bar mitzvah, when you come of age at 13 and you have this party because now you're of age. Today, 13 is not an adult, right? 13 in our culture today is junior high, as opposed to back then, 13, 6,000 years ago, you hit puberty. Your expectation of reproduction and stuff like that, you were moving into that after 13. So a lot of different cultures have ways of marking that movement into adulthood right around puberty. Those markings don't necessarily make sense in today's cultures, but they're still this cultural attribute. But where they started, they usually did make sense, becoming an adult at 13, for example. And so if you think about sitting Shiva, if it's inevitable that we're going to die, and you had a lot more people dying in cultures 6,000 years ago, right? So what would happen if family members around you were dying like every year and you were in a constant state of mourning? Nothing would get done. People wouldn't be raising food. They wouldn't be trading. The rest of us wouldn't survive. So in a lot of cultures, this kind of strict way of adhering to a mourning process was a way of giving people time to mourn, but also then saying, okay, now it's time to move on. Now it's time to go back to work. So take these 7 days, think about the person, don't think about yourself, mourn, and then go back to work because there's still people alive. That makes sense? So over here in Ghana, Ghana is in West Africa. You see Africa over here. Ghana is this little country right next to the Ivory Coast and Benin. And in Ghana, you have these funeral celebrations that are gigantic parties. If you're ever in Ghana and somebody invites you to a funeral, really, like, you could be sitting in a bar and somebody would say, hey, come to this funeral. And you're like, why would I go to a funeral? I've never met this person, but it's this gigantic party. So people save up their entire lives for parties in Ghana, for like their funeral party in Ghana, even though they're dead when it happens. You'll have like an all night, just gigantic rave is basically what it looks like, where people will have like multiple DJs, different bands set up, a whole lot of food, a whole lot of drink, and this is how you celebrate that person's life. Like I said, it's cathartic, and it's a way of acknowledging that that person was here, that we enjoyed them, but also kind of, it's a different way of mourning. And these are two pretty opposite ways of mourning, but they both accomplish the same thing. That is to recognize the person's life and then to move on as a person who's still alive. Now, if we look at different funeral processes around the world, because so many of our cultures have mixed and blended, and a lot of times we can't see how they've blended anymore because they blended so long ago, you'll have things like, this is a Catholic procession. So this idea that Catholics have, that we basically march people through the streets, it's this idea of like marching them on their final walk home, if that makes sense. So taking them from the church to the burial ground. And that movement, and today we don't, around the world, we don't necessarily always do it here with a horse and carriage. If you've ever seen a hearse, and that hearse procession with multiple cars behind it, people going from the church to where they're going to bury the person, that procession is kind of like their final walk through life before they go home being where they're going after this life. And so we see elements of this leaked into a lot of different cultures, even if they're not necessarily Catholic practicing cultures, because of maybe a Catholic history or a history of like Catholicism being used in colonization or something like that. You'll have this presence of the funeral procession and that idea of like walking this person home before they're going home, hopefully to heaven, right? If you're Catholic. Okay, so that brings us to one of the most unique funeral processions in the world. And I have a little video posted on Canvas that you're going to watch after this of a New Orleans funeral. So New Orleans is a very special place. Let's go to our map, back to our map. So here's New Orleans, little tiny spot right there at the end of the Mississippi. It is a natural city because it's at the end of this major river system and this drainage basin. Basically, that's a natural place for trade. And New Orleans has this whole complicated history. So you have, first of all, this whole part of the South, if you've never been there, or if you don't know what it's like, it's very marshy. It's very, very hot. It's very humid. They get hit with hurricanes, of course. And the indigenous people who lived here, there were thousands of different indigenous nations that lived in North America before European and then East Asian and then African people came here. Thousands of nations, thousands of different nations. And some of them were gigantic, like the Iroquois, for example, who went all up and down the East Coast, or the Algonquin, who had a trade network through a huge part of what's now Canada and the US. The Sioux, and there was many different people who were associated with the Sioux, the Lakota, the Dakota, lived all through the prairie here. So what really dictated your nation size was your physical geography. Over here on the East Coast, this part of North America, if you go past the Appalachians, is pretty flat. There's a whole lot of, like I said in an earlier lecture, there's a whole lot of opportunity for basically there's a lot of bays. There's a lot of ways that like the coast cuts in. So there's a lot of opportunity for trade. So the Iroquois expanded their nation all along this coast because it was an easy place physical geography wise to expand trade networks. Whereas if we go over here to the other side, what's today California, the nations who lived here were broken up into much, much smaller groups. The Chumash were a considerable sized group, but they were nothing in size compared to, like, let's say the Iroquois or the Algonquin. In fact, the biggest nations that we would have seen here in California would have been on the coast, the coastal nations. There were 400 different indigenous nations in California back before the colonization of California. 400 different nations just in this one state. And they were pretty small. And a lot of them were fractured because California's geography is fractured. Think about California. It's coast, mountains, valley, more valley, bigger mountains, deeper valley, Death Valley. It's a lot. We have 3 different types of deserts here. True deserts, high elevation deserts, orographic deserts. We have a really, really varied physical geography, which lent itself to smaller, isolated groups of people. So if you get a feel for how the nations of North America really varied depending on their physical geography, let's go back down here to the swampy parts of what is today New Orleans, Mississippi, that whole area. And the nations there tended to be a little more fragmented as well. Whereas like just up here in the plains, you had much larger nations because think about it, it was flat. The trade networks would have been easier to create as opposed to the isolated marshes down here. Okay, so we have that element, right? We're talking about New Orleans. The element of the indigenous people. And then it's colonized by the French. And the French come in and they colonize what's called Louisiana, and they set up plantations. Basically, if you look at Europe was based on an agricultural economy, as everybody was at that time. There was no mass manufacturing yet. So the way that you got wealthy was by owning land. And look at how small Europe is. It's very limited in the amount of land that you can own. So part of the desire of European colonizers to come over here was to expand their land holdings. And so when Louisiana is set up by the French, they set up a bunch of plantations, sugar plantations, all the kinds of things that you see throughout the South that you wouldn't have been able to grow here, both because you didn't have the land for it and you didn't have the climate for it. And then you probably know that the Louisiana Purchase happened. And Louisiana Purchase leads the US to absorb this colony that had been part of the French colonial empire. Now, remember I said that this is at the end of a big river, the Mississippi River, and that it's a natural city. Now, during African enslavement, this would have been a major trade center, not just for sugar and other agricultural products, but this is a place where people would have been directly brought into North America. So in a later lecture, much later, I'll show you a map of African slavery and like where people came from, where they were stolen from, and then moved across. You had like a huge number of people who were moved across to Brazil. Brazil was a major trading post, and New Orleans was a major trading post as well. So you had a significant number of people who weren't just enslaved in New Orleans, but who were brought over after the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage being a significant part of dehumanizing people and forcing them into this enslavement. And that's something considerable we're going to talk about later in the semester. The idea that in order to enslave someone, it's not just about literally stealing and owning their body, it's also about this mental enslavement that happens. And if you've ever seen Roots or read Roots, there's this significant scene. Kunta Kinte is being beaten by the person who claims to now own him, and is telling him like, your name is Toby, and he's like, no, my name is Kunta Kinte. It's a very famous scene, but it's a great example of how the people who were stolen from the continent, the people who enslaved them then had to kind of attempt to break that individual will. Because if you come from a culture, if you come from a nation of people, you have a self-identity, you have a cultural identity. And this Middle Passage right here was all about breaking that cultural identity. So, and I will come back to that later in the semester. But so we had this direct movement of people directly from Eastern Africa, where people were stolen from. And you also had people who were traded from other parts of the American South and from the Caribbean. Okay, so we have a good idea of the indigenous populations there before. We have an idea of the French, and French are Catholic, as opposed to the rest of the US wouldn't have been Catholic. New Orleans is this Catholic outlier city in the rest of the South, which has a pretty strong, not just Christian, but Baptist Christian kind of flair to it. So that Catholic outpost of New Orleans gives it a little bit of a difference. Plus, it still had these entrenched indigenous cultures around it, where if you were a big culture, if you were a big nation like the Iroquois, you were more visible, if that makes sense. Whereas people who were in these kind of smaller, isolated nations through the swamps down here or through like the Sierra Nevada mountains, because they were smaller, they were kind of harder to get at. So you had a lot of indigenous nations who lasted longer in the post-colonial era. Okay, so we have our indigenous populations, we have our people who are coming directly from Africa, who are traded in New Orleans, and we have the Catholic history. All of that together creates a really, really unique culture in New Orleans. It's one of the reasons that what becomes African American culture in New Orleans has a lot more ties. So if you think about African American culture, the culture of people who were enslaved and then who were descendants of slaves, in New Orleans, that culture would have more strongly been impacted by African culture, if that makes sense, because there was more of a direct link, as opposed to people who had been the children of, and then the children of, and then the children of, and the culture that was a result of that. So all of this together, Catholicism, a strong African presence, and then this Shoshone presence, all of that comes together and you can see elements of every single part of those cultures in this New Orleans jazz funeral. So this jazz funeral is one where people essentially are walking the person home, and as they're walking the person home, sorry, coughing. So the New Orleans funeral has elements of Catholicism in that people are being walked home. They're basically coming from the church and going to where they're going to be buried. You have the jazz element, and jazz is our first US original music. So there was original music before in North America, but jazz starts in New Orleans and is directly a result of the African and African American cultures there. And this second lining, as you're going along in the streets and you're proceeding along the streets, you're carrying this person home as you do in Catholicism, you're also dancing. So this music element of jazz and that uniquely African American culture, and then the dancing that happens behind that. Well, where is that dancing from? If you remember, in our Ghana celebration here and in other West African cultures, you have these all-night parties that happen as a funeral procession. So if you can see just the multiple different cultural influences that come to create this very unique jazz funeral. And when you watch the video that I posted, I hope you can see that the Shoshone, the indigenous cultures of like the surrounding area, you can see that element in the costuming that people, the things that people wear often when they're second lining. So look for all of that. Second lining is the term for this procession of musicians. So look for all that when you watch that video. But I like using the New Orleans Jazz Funeral as an example in the beginning of the semester of how culture today is no longer just a result of like the physical place that you live. There's all these different factors that are going to come in, right? We have the factors of indigenous people who were here before colonization, the colonial French past, the enslavement of Africans, the formation of an African American culture in this Catholic city, the touches of Shoshone and other indigenous people's cultures then coming in the costuming, because one relationship that was formed between African people who were enslaved in New Orleans and then the indigenous people who were able to remain in the in different parts of what became Louisiana and Mississippi, is that if you think about people who wanted to escape enslavement, if you lived up here, for example, in Maryland, Maryland was a state that allowed for slavery, and right across the border was Pennsylvania, which was a free state. So, for example, Harriet Tubman is a person who was enslaved in Maryland and she escaped into Pennsylvania. It was about a 100-mile trek for her. 100 miles is a lot. And she did that many, many times because she came back and led a whole lot of people to freedom. Frederick Douglass was also from Maryland and escaped into Pennsylvania. But when you were way down here, how likely was it that you were going to be able to travel all the way through the entire South to get to a free state? So your hope down here was the indigenous groups of people who were holdouts. And there was this relationship that was formed between Africans who were enslaved in the US and indigenous people who lived in what's today Louisiana and Mississippi. And there was this relationship where enslaved people would be hidden by and either become parts of those indigenous nations, or those people, the indigenous nations, would help basically have a network to get that person, that enslaved person, out of a slave state. So there's a lot going on there, I know, but what I'm trying to do is paint a picture for you to see how like complex culture can be and how many different influences that we might not necessarily see are there. Okay, so with weddings, that's something else that tends to be this visible cultural attribute. But again, there's a whole lot that happens in a wedding that we don't necessarily know the origins of or where they come from. So the majority of countries today in the world have marriage and have a wedding ceremony. Bhutan doesn't have a marriage ceremony. Basically, if a man and a woman live together, they're considered married. As opposed to other countries in the world where a woman, and we're talking like a 10-year-old, can be abducted on the street, and you have a person who is parents who are forced to concede to a marriage match. Now, we're going to come back and talk about marriage a whole lot later in the semester. We're going to talk about the economic origins of marriage and how marriage looks different in different parts of the world today. But today I'm just looking at different types of ceremonies. And marriage hasn't been around with us forever. Marriage is about 11,000 years old. And I'm going to explain later in the semester that it has a significant economic origin, and that when that style of economy spreads around the world, so does marriage. But so we have the wedding ring. The wedding ring comes from Greece, and the wedding ring is it's supposed to be on your left hand on your ring finger. And the Greek believed that there was a vein that went from your ring finger to your heart. And so that might sound very romantic, but it was actually like this cuff. Like if you had a vein that was related to your heart right here, then I'm going to cuff it in ownership, if that makes sense. Bridesmaids, if you know, bridesmaids are supposed to wear similar dresses. That comes from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan most likely. And it was because there was a whole lot of superstition around brides, that people thought that like ghosts were going to take brides, that brides were going to demons were going to come and kidnap brides. So the bridesmaids' dresses being similar, it used to be that everybody wore the same dress, the bride and the bridesmaids, and they were set up so that if a demon was going to come and kidnap the bride, the demon would be confused and hopefully take one of the bridesmaids instead. So that's where that comes from. It comes from this origin story of take my bridesmaids, not me. Germany has a whole lot of our kind of current wedding norms. A lot of them come from Germany. Like, for example, the best man. So you used to have people kidnapping their brides in places like Germany. And again, when we get into marriage later, we'll talk about like what the point of marriage was in the beginning. So in Germany, you would have these people who would kidnap the bride, and her father might wake, let's say you kidnap her in the middle of the night and her father wakes up and he's like running after you. The best man was there to fight him. So you're going to go kidnap this woman, and then your best man is going to like fight off anybody who's going to come and try to save her. And that's why his placement is right here. So basically on like the sword side. The bride across the threshold comes from Germany as well. And so if you know, today we have this kind of cultural idea of after you get married, you like carry your bride across the threshold. Well, virginity is made up basically when marriage is made up. And the idea like becomes so indoctrinated into different cultures that women aren't supposed to like sex, and women are supposed to like only reluctantly give up their virginity. So when you have these brides who are carried across the threshold, it's supposed to be a sign that they're not willingly going to have sex. So like you get married and you're supposed to consummate the marriage by having sex, but the carrying across the threshold is like this visual, protest of like, I'm going to do it, but I don't like it. And then they used to, in Germany, witness the consummation. So like after you carried the bride across the threshold, like a whole bunch of people from your family would then watch you have sex for the first time to witness the consummation. And that had to do with where marriage comes from, which is the idea of inheritance. And that if you have land and you want to pass it on to your children, you need to know who your children are. And so how you know who your children are is if the woman that is having your children only has sex with you. So basically that's why virginity becomes a thing. Women only having sex with one person, and suppose like this morality around sex is a result of, if she only has sex with one person, her legitimate husband, then that legitimate husband knows that those children are his heirs. And so the consummation of the marriage was another way of kind of like just furthering and like seeing that, okay, any children that come from this, we're literally witnessing that those are his children. So brides were often seen as bad luck magnets. All right, so housing styles, that's another thing that we might see around the world that differs. We might see, of course, we see housing around the world. But it differs depending on where you are. The Iroquois, I mentioned the Iroquois earlier when I talked about the Iroquois nation that ran along the East Coast. If you know Pocahontas, which I'm sure you probably have heard of Pocahontas before, she was Powhatan, and Powhatan was part of the Iroquois nation. Just to give you an idea of kind of like how gigantic that nation was. And so the Iroquois nation, where they were agricultural and trade-based, so they would have stayed in the same place. a lot of, I don't know, people still have this stereotype today, but like when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, there was this stereotype of Indigenous Americans that they were like all migratory. I think that that was a specific story that was told to make it seem like people were uncivilized, as in like if they didn't even have, one set place to live, then who cares if people came along and annihilated them, basically. I'm not saying that that's what I think. I'm saying that that's why that narrative started. It was a way of kind of dismissing any established nations, established civilizations that were here. Because if you come and wreck and annihilate entire civilizations, well, that's something that you need to atone for. But if you just kind of like pushed people who weren't really civilized and et cetera, it's the whole idea that like the people who lived here were savages. So one thing that was often pushed was that people weren't sedentary, but it depended on where you lived. Once again, your physical geography dictates your culture. So in the Iroquois Nation, because of the soil and because of the trade network, you had these people who were sedentary and who had this vast trade network. And so their housing was sedentary as well. And it was what was called the longhouse. You'd have like 20 families who lived in here. Now think about that. Why would 20 families live here? Well, if you're thinking for warmth, you're right. That basically collecting bodies together before you had like central heating was a way of staying warm. These are people who would have lived in today's Pennsylvania, sorry, in today's New York, not in New York, they weren't that far north, but in places that get very, very cold in the winter is what I'm trying to say. And then rites of passage, that's something I was talking about earlier with the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. You see rites of passage or coming of age ceremonies in all kinds of different cultures. Think about the quinceañera, excuse me, the bar and bat mitzvah, sweet 16. What else? There's many other ones. Aboriginal people in Australia, you go walkabout when you're about 12, 13 years old. They all have to do, they're generally all around puberty, and they all have to do with the transition from childhood to puberty. And with puberty comes the possibility of procreating, right? Of having children. So there was this kind of significant shift in expectation of a person when they go from pre-puberty to post-puberty, basically. And most of our rites of passage have to do with that. And the final thing I want to talk about with culture, visible culture, is housing style. And I know you're looking at this and thinking like, what the hell is that? So in different parts of the world, we have different kind of norms for housing. If we were to go to, let's say, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, you would see this same kind of clustering of housing. The reason that I used this diagram is because it's supposed to show clustering of housing around a common threshold. So we see this in a lot of different parts of the world. Here in the US, we have a culture that very much idolizes individuality and an individual ideology, but that's not true in other parts of the world. And one way that we can see this is through our housing style. Think about like what is considered an adult, like an established adult, somebody who owns a single family home, right? One that stands alone. Whereas other parts of the world, a single family home is not something that you would have. What you would have is a house or part of a house that's connected to extended family members. And so if we were to go to Southwest Asia, for example, you have houses that are connected and clustered together, usually around a common threshold. What that allows for, first of all, is shade. We're talking about a part of the world that is very, very, very hot. And so again, before you have central air conditioning, just like before you had centralized heating for the Iroquois, you had a need to create insulation, and clustering houses together and having those houses form natural shade around a courtyard was a way of creating like a cooler, insulated house. It was also, a way of like you paint your houses very light. So let me show you my picture on Morocco. There we go. So this is Morocco. Morocco is North Africa, but North Africa, Southwest Asia have similar cultures, similar housing styles. And if you can see, very light colored, first of all. And also, if you can see that there's kind of like this clustering of houses and usually a common courtyard in the middle, It's a way of allowing for, once again, like I said, shade and insulation, but also for extended family members. And if you have extended family members, your parents live here, your auntie lives here, you know, your sister lives over here, then remember that with visible and invisible culture, family styles and like who is expected to take care of children and stuff like that differs from different countries. So essentially, if you live in Southwest Asia, and it's not just Southwest Asia, where there's this expectation that it's not just the two parents who take care of children, but it's the whole extended family. And think about how that changes things like the need for daycare, or the pressure that goes on our individual ideology here in the US also kind of dictates that we individually take on like all of the responsibility of raising our children, which of course you should be responsible for raising your children, but that also puts a humongous amount of pressure, financial pressure, on individual parents, as opposed to extended family networks like we might see in Southwest Asia. So, and you know, hopefully you like your family, for one, if you're going to have this extended family network. So we see this same style replicated in different places, like here, once again, in West Africa. We have this similar clustering of houses. Now the housing styles are going to be different. They're going to, again, be a reaction to the climate. What we have as building materials are going to hopefully create a cool kind of inner dwelling. If we look again, though, we have this circular extended family base where your mother, your auntie, your sister, they all live around here. And then you have this kind of central family hearth. We also see that in Montserrat. Montserrat is an island in the Caribbean. Now, an island in the Caribbean, why would an island in the Caribbean have a very similar housing structure to West Africa? Once again, because of the transfer of Africans, the involuntary movement of Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and the rest of the Americas. While the Middle Passage attempted to destroy the individualism, the cultural identity, the individual identity of people that were being enslaved, it wasn't completely destroyed. Little things stayed present. Little things like this kind of circular extended family, as like your core family. Also kinship. Notice that in what I'm describing, I keep saying like your mom, your aunt, your sister. West African cultures and a lot of Caribbean cultures are kinship based instead of being paternity based, meaning that like the father is the person whose name you inherit, and family lineage just kind of goes along the father's lines. In a kinship based family style, you go mother to children, mother to children. And so in that way, the children don't necessarily take on the name and don't necessarily even live with their biological father. The people who are responsible for children in, let's say, Montserrat are the mother, of course, and her brothers. And so that would be the paternalist presence is something that's based on kinship as opposed to marriage and paternity. So when I introduce this in class, a lot of people think that it's strange when I try to switch your head from thinking a paternalist family structure as opposed to a kinship family structure. But it's just dependent on culture, right? And cultural norms. And then finally, if we go to a place like Southeast Asia, where you get monsoons, you get these like major rainstorms for 2 months of the year, and you get feet of rain, not inches, but your rainstorms are measured by feet, then you have to lift your house up, right? Having a house on the ground means you're going to have a whole lot of flooding. So this also allows for air to flow under the house. You live in a very hot, very humid place. This allows for air circulation. It all has to do with the physical geography. So I hope that that introduces you to the idea that culture can very much come from physical geography. And we are going to venture back into regional economic growth, looking at Latin America next time. Okay.